Before we dive in, I have a few reminders for you. First, closed captioning is available in English. To access this, click on the CC icon at the bottom or top of your screen. Second, we invite you to post questions or comments in the chat as you are listening. We will monitor the chat for questions as we go. Third, please make sure that you are unmuted and your camera is on when you are speaking. If you are not speaking, we ask you kindly to mute your microphone. Finally, remember that we are recording this and it will be shared publicly after the event. The objectives of today's workshop are to learn about strengthening resilience and coordination capabilities of local education institutions through ACER's Policy Monitoring Toolkit, to assess and enhance preparedness and disaster risk reduction capacities of local institutions using this tool through ACER's Policy Monitoring Toolkit, and to share experience and learnings with ECCN members across regions to support localization of the Policy Monitoring Toolkit. The agenda for our time together today is as follows. After opening remarks, we will have a deep dive into the policy monitoring tool. We will turn to our participants for some deep dives with them in plenary sessions. We will take a short break, followed by group discussion and some closing and summative remarks. Today's workshop will end at 8:30 p.m. AWST or 8:30 a.m. EST. Now let's take a moment to reflect on the learnings from the first workshop of this series. Use the QR code on the screen or the link in the chat to please share one key takeaway from workshop 1 or the one-pager exercise. So if you are able to scan the QR code or simply navigate your browser to slido.com and enter the number that you see on the screen, 3484944, you can post some responses to this question. I can see that at least 2 people have been able to navigate to the page and are typing. So Pina, I would like to invite you to offer us some introductory remarks and to share reflections as they appear on the screen.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. And we're so excited to be here again today with you all. And thank you for completing the work that you did in your own time, the one-pager exercise. And we're looking forward to discussing that more with you later and also your presentations as well. So this is interesting. So thank you for this feedback just now. So we've got some things here. So while Education Emergencies Policy Monitoring Tool is commendable, some additional thoughts, training workshops, specific disaster plans. The policy monitoring framework looks at system factors, teaching learning factors, and agents factors. Yes, that's correct. And we're glad that that's helpful to you. Yes, and resilience and recovery reinforce each other. That's right. We agree with that as well. And I'm sorry that I'm not able to read all of those points under training and workshops. So here we go. Disaster plans, pollution-related crises and crises of disease. Conflict and war situations as well. So all of these are very important points that we can consider as well when we're talking about the use of the framework and the tool. So depth of various policy issues, focus on preparedness, response and recovery phases. Yes, education emergencies are very, very complex. So national, regional and local levels of response, need to systemize factors, issues, considerations across emergency phases. Yes, we agree with that as well. So these are all very important and very useful responses, and it's good to highlight these as well in your discussions later when you present your work on your one-pager exercise. So I'd like to now hand over to Kemran Mestan, who will be doing a recap on the policy monitoring framework and tool. Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Kemra.
Great, thank you, Pina and Kate. And thanks for those responses there. And surely I will present more systematically a collation of the responses that you provided as part of that one-page exercise. And then you'll get a chance to engage in dialogue and present what you did in those activities. But before that, we thought it would be important to do a quick recap of what we learned last week. So particularly the policy framework and the policy monitoring tool. So the policy monitoring framework conceptualizes the impact and management of education before, during, and after emergencies. The framework helps policymakers to understand how emergencies are likely to impact education and develop strategies to manage and build resilient education systems in the context of emergencies. The framework is underpinned by 3 phases: preparedness, response, and recovery, which need to be considered for operationalizing policy plans and activities, as well as analyzing data to inform decision-making. So you will recall the framework includes 3 types of factors, and I saw that in one of the comments that one of you made just previously, you recognize those 3 factors, which were systems factors. These include central processes, practices, networks, and relations that policymakers engage with and within. Teaching and learning factors, which includes all activities and resources that are directly related to how teachers teach and how students learn and are assessed. And later in today's session, I'm going to discuss with you an application of the tool, specifically looking at these teacher and learning factors. The final kind of factor is agents factors, which refer to entities that can make decisions and act over the course of emergency management phases. To further support policymakers' efforts to build resilient education systems, those aforementioned types of factors, that is, the systems, teaching and learning, and agents factors, were elaborated into policy considerations to address the impact of management of education in emergencies. So these policy considerations are activities that policymakers needed to consider in undertaking in building a more resilient education system. These policy considerations were combined with the policy monitoring framework to produce the policy monitoring tool. This was achieved by mapping pertinent education in emergency factors and considerations against the preparedness, response, and recovery emergency management phases. I know many of you now have had a chance to look and apply the tool to your circumstances, which we will discuss more shortly, and also work with you looking at those teacher and learning factors. The tool helps policymakers to consider to what extent they need to undertake specific activities to build a more resilient education system. By drawing on the policy considerations and applying the education in emergency policy monitoring framework via the tool, policymakers can identify the factors and considerations relevant to each phase of emergency management and work towards building a more resilient education system. As you can see on the screen, this is one small element of the tool. The consideration of planning for emergencies in education is presented. Then that is broken into 5 elements or issues, whereby policymakers are led to provide a risk rating according to each phase of emergency management. This task is then undertaken for each policy consideration. You can see the next policy consideration under the systems factor is 1.2, institute strong coordination and collaboration. Later, we will work together to apply the tool to issues related to teaching and learning considerations. But now I'll present the collated information that you provided us in the one-page activity we asked you to complete. Thanks to all of you who submitted responses to our activity, asking you to engage in the activity we asked you to engage in relating to the tool. We reviewed and collated all your responses, which I will now summarize so that you can see the thinking of your fellow participants and learn from each other. Then in the next section, Ian will ask you to elaborate and discuss your responses. In considering how you would apply the policy monitoring tool, you told us that the following data or information was available. Ministry policy documents, so these included reports and evaluations pre- and post-pandemic statistics, educational legislation, school mapping data, learning gap analysis, international comparisons, project data, community feedback. So in the discussion later with Ian, we really look forward on you elaborating on some of that feedback. For example, to learn a little bit more about the learning gap analysis that at least one of you was involved with, the school mapping data that you're aware about. That would be really interesting to learn a little bit more about. You added that the data or information can be found at ministries and organisations at the national and local level, ministry databases, regional delegations, education cluster operational framework, education sector COVID-19 response plans, and I know those are related to GPE processes and documents, the National Emergency Network, research papers such as academic articles, international development agencies, project records from donors and implementing partners, stakeholder interviews. And it's really great that some of you either have been involved with or aware of the possibility of engaging with stakeholders, such as, for example, community members that was referenced in the previous slide, news articles and blogs. In regard to the reliability and validity of the data or information that you can source, you said the source of data in these tools is valid and reliable. The data was consolidated under the leadership of Ministry of Education and the coordination of the education cluster. Data are not reliable as there is undeveloped identification and reporting of children with disabilities and especially ethnic minorities. The data and statistics from the Department of Basic Education and international agencies like UNICEF is comprehensive and has been collected ethically to be used for research and policy development purposes. Blogs and news articles may not be reliable, but they give context and direction for further research. For schools, data is valid and reliable, but for staff and students, the data is difficult to obtain, therefore has low validity and reliability. So that will be really interesting in that section with, in the next section where you're talking with Ian to learn about, for example, why is it difficult to obtain data from staff and students whilst it's much easier from schools. This is what you said about the extent that the data or information is relevant to your policy issues. The monitoring is made for public reporting, but not to recuperate individual to the system for learning purposes. Climate shocks and COVID-19 caused volatility of education. Schools were shut and there is a lack of remote learning. Enhancing training, specifying disaster plans, accounting for pollution-related crises, and streamlining international intervention in conflicts can further strengthen the effectiveness of education resilience strategies. And we've seen some of that referred to in that first exercise you did, where you provided some of your feedback about section 1 or the first workshop. Relevant in regard to refugees, girls in unpaid labour, political unrest, and remedial and accelerated learning programs were implemented. Finally, you gave us some useful reflections about how relevant the policy monitoring tool is to your policy issues. The policy framework was a key guiding document that outlined the strategic directions, key approaches and activities and operational modalities in order to achieve our objectives. Through that policy, our organisation responded to education in emergencies in collaboration with other education stakeholders. The tool is helpful and data would strongly contribute to the allocated risk cover. The PMT represents a significant stride toward building resilient education systems in the face of emergencies. By combining a comprehensive framework with a practical tool, policymakers can address critical policy considerations and issues swiftly, adapting them to their unique context. I will now hand over to Ian, who will lead a discussion with you about your application of the tool. So Ian, please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Cameron. Greetings, everybody. It's really great to be meeting with you here again and to have this opportunity to discuss, hopefully in much deeper detail, the policy monitoring tool. Firstly, I would like to thank you once again for taking the time to join us at this workshop, and I look forward to discussing with you your impressions about the policy monitoring tool, how it was used and its potential utility. I think, what we would love to do really is to have a dialogue with you and really dig deeper into how you thought this tool worked, did not work, everything in between. Were there any insights that you gained from it? Are there any challenges perhaps with the tool as well? So, if you do have any thoughts, please put them into the chat. Please feel free to put your hand up and engage with us. More than willing for you to interrupt me or any of us, I think, at any point during this workshop. Moving on. As outlined by Cameron, this section of the workshop will focus on 2 activities relating to the policy monitoring tool, and in particular, how we might develop a policy heat map. The first activity involves a dialogue with 5 participants, so thank you to those 5 participants, about how they use the PMT heat map. As you know, participants were asked to indicate at the end of workshop number 1, in a pre-workshop 2 activity, whether they would be willing to discuss their responses with other participants during workshop 2 today. Depending on the responses received, ACER invited participants to be part of this discussion, and we are therefore very fortunate to have with us participants from Guatemala, Kenya, the Middle East, South Africa, who have agreed to participate in this discussion. So we hope that this section of the workshop will involve, once again, an interactive dialogue between participants, the audience and myself, and of course, we welcome comments and feedback in the Zoom chat feature. So without further delay, I'd like to perhaps introduce our presenters, our speakers, and go through the following questions to help frame our dialogue. Depending on our discussion, we may focus on just these questions alone, as you can see on screen, or perhaps you might veer towards other topics as they become unearthed. So I would like to welcome, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, we have Abdi Kadir Issa Farah from Somalia. We have Allah Samadi from the Middle East. We have Patricia Zelatia from Guatemala. We have Fiona Nakashore from South Africa. And I think we have Sanda Kanai, perhaps from Kenya as well. If you are here, would you please turn on your camera so that we can at least see you and recognize you? If you're able to, of course. Okay, what about Allah, Patricia, Fiona? Do we have these individuals in the group?
Hello, yes, I'm here. This is Ala from Jordan, Middle East.
Hi, Allah.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, I'm Fiona from South Africa.
Hi, Fiona. Thank you for joining us. So we've got Allah, we have Fiona. Do we have Patricia with us?
Yeah. Good morning or afternoon to everybody. I'm Patricia.
Great. Hello, Patricia. And do we have Abdi Kadir with us? Abdi Kadir? I think I see you in the participants, but perhaps you're having a little bit of trouble trying to unmute. Okay, well, we might move on. Allah, perhaps we could start with you and we could move through things alphabetically. So we'll start off with Allah, Patricia, and Fiona. And if the other 2 speakers are able to join us, fantastic. Otherwise, we might just dig a little bit deeper into some of the comments and feedback that you've provided to us. So what we'd really love to do is to hear about a little bit about your background, what your organization is, how you were involved, perhaps in education and emergencies. And then, of course, feel free to share from your worksheet if you would like to. So you would have to share screen. Alternatively, if you're happy to have a verbal dialogue, we'd be very happy to engage you like that. And then finally, if you could just respond also, in addition to introducing yourself, also respond to the questions on screen. Okay? So perhaps, Allah, if you could start us off, that'd be great. And I'm happy to walk you through the process as we go.
Oh, right. Okay. So I'll start introducing. Sorry. Oh yeah, I'll start introducing myself. Sorry, because my video is off, because to avoid any internet interruption or something like this. So this is Ala from Jordan, Middle East. I have been working in the field of monitoring and evaluation since 2013. I started working with one of the organization in Syrian camps in Jordan, in Zatri, Azraq, and another camp as well. So most of my experience in monitoring and evaluation in different kind of fields and the projects, such as emergency. In emergency, there were like different also projects, education, hygiene, shelter, and etc. I also worked in development projects such as livelihood and entrepreneurship, and as well as environment and others. So yes, I'm happy to participate in this workshop. So may I start now with asking the questions, and yeah. So in what ways might be the PMT be used in your respective organization or government departments? So I worked with different NGOs, local and international and royal, and there were like different kind of projects in education. And also I worked with Norwegian Refugee Council in a bit in education for in camps for Syrian refugees. Okay, in what ways might we? Okay, I might here.
That sounds like a very complex emergency situation that you find yourself in oftentimes, Allah. It's not just a pandemic, it's multiple emergencies going on at once. Would that be correct?
Sorry, again.
Oh, sorry. So I was commenting that it's given your job and given your engagement with education and emergencies, it sounds like oftentimes you're dealing with complex emergencies. It's not just one emergency, but multiple emergencies compounded on each other. Would that be correct?
Right. This is correct, because there were like the pandemic, the refugees, already the pandemic affect the education, and of course the vulnerable ones in different areas, in camps. Yes. Yeah. Maybe I'll read it from the paper I shared. Well,
Sure.
should I do?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So apply the tool of to the education system contexts in which you work. All right. The Education and Emergency Policy Monitoring Tool created by the GAM Center serves as a valuable resource for education policymakers. It facilitates the prioritization of activities at various levels, national, regional, and local, with the ultimate goal of strengthening the resilience of education system. This tool occupies policymakers with a structured approach to address critical policy consideration and issues, ensuring a more robust response to emergencies such as the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
I have I wrote down like some thoughts, like I was maybe not from this paper, but this paper maybe. Okay. Training and workshops. Implementing a training and workshop for students, training staff, community-based organization, civil society organization, and all relevant stakeholders. This educational approach can enhance awareness and preparedness for various emergency scenarios. Specific disaster plans, tailoring preparedness plans for different types of disasters, such as earthquakes, natural climates. Also, these plans should be well-defined and tested to ensure that education can continue seamlessly in the face of such crisis, population-related crisis and crisis of disease, conflict and war situation. In this scenario is really different than the others, because this is really, really complicated, and it differs from region to region, and of course from country to country, and within the same country maybe it differs, and it depends on the country. So we can't, it's really complex. You can't expect anything in conflict and war situations. So this is here should be like international actors must take a lead in monitoring the education, especially in cases of internal conflicts, and ensure safe condition should, of course, to ensure safe condition. In such scenarios, an international actor should oversee education and ensure student safety. Additionally, we should integrate technology methods into education, which should be suitable for vulnerable population and communities. A swift international response are crucial for ensuring continuous education. Sorry, because I felt like I'm just reading. This is why were my thoughts about it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, particularly with regard to the second question, are there any challenges that you've just mentioned there, or any solutions there that are unique to your particular experience with education emergencies? One that particularly stands out as either incredibly difficult to address or a solution or strategy that has been particularly effective. I think part of the goal of the policy monitoring tool is not just to identify factors and considerations and issues, it's also to identify potential solutions. And so when we address and when we identify a challenge, then presumably we would want to try to find a solution to that as well. And I'm just wondering what your experience has been. Is there a particular challenge that has been very difficult, or a solution that has been very effective?
Yes, I faced several challenges. Like one of the most complicated one, let's say, it's the centralized system, and the Ministry of Education, let's say, there were different let's say people working there, and the communication was complicated. There is when no one can make a decision. It's really centralized, and all decisions should be made by one. And this is one of the most challenge I've been through my experience working in education. And there is no community participant can participate, or schools can provide their solutions or their suggestions to mitigate any challenge comes like COVID-19 or any emergency comes when it comes to any education issues. The centralized system, it's really complicated, and it's the most, in my opinion, is the most challenge anyone can have, at least here in my region, my country. So yeah.
And given that's very, very significant challenge, I mean, you can always say it's important to manage communication. It's important to manage planning, for example. But has there ever been any particular strategy that you found was particularly useful when working within centralized governments or centralized hierarchies? Perhaps might be the better way to explain it.
Maybe in COVID-19, and they were shifting to remote and online. It was really successful for some cases, but wasn't successful in for other vulnerable, let's say, Jordanians and refugees. Yeah.
Okay. So could you say that again? Just what the particular strategy might have been useful?
Actually, I'm brainstorming to remember what's let's say, it was different things and different strategies. But I think shifting, there were let's say a quick response to this crisis. It was quickly, and it really works. And I think it was good for some areas. It was really good for some areas, yeah, but not for the whole country.
Yeah, and I think a quick response is incredibly hard to manage because sometimes we don't know what it is that we're looking for. Sometimes the data may not be there from which to draw on. People may not be prepared. Teachers, for example, may not have the appropriate training, for example. But we do know, of course, that a fast response, one that is targeted, one that's coordinated, one that's well communicated, will afford opportunities that can, make a very measured, purposeful response, recovery, or work towards preparation across the emergency management phases. Absolutely. I think, I think obviously a fast response is a very important thing. Thank you very much, Ala. I might throw to Patricia with a similar set of questions, which is, could you please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your organization, what it is that you do, and then perhaps tell us a little bit about your thoughts about the PMT. And the second question, tell us a little bit about the challenges faced when developing policies for education and emergencies. So Patricia, all yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening. I am Patricia, and I am from Guatemala, a country in Central America. I am part of the Health and Education Office at USAID Guatemala. I've been an educator for quite a while, but with the mission, I've been around 4 years. My position there is as a project manager specialist in education, and that is the role. Regarding the questions, I would say that in what ways might the framework be used? I think as I mentioned that we are part of a cluster of emergency and education in my country, and I think the cluster is already organized. So one of the things, and a step further in this cluster, will be actually to present to the members of the cluster, including the Ministry of Education, tools as this one, so they can actually make one a step further into actually working towards preventing the problems with especially with the re-entry of students into emergencies. So that will be a way into using the framework. The other one would be for us to actually try it out as in our projects, as a way of piloting, and then presenting the results to the network of donors and institutions within the cluster, to actually present data that could actually convince the rest of the donors to actually take a look at the framework and see if it is possible to align it to the different documents and the different processes that they have been already established. And I'm going to already jump onto that, because onto the second question, onto the challenges, Guatemala, we have different challenges regarding emergencies. There is a hard rainy season, for example, as it is right now, in the months of May to October. This month is a particular hard one. At the same time, we are prone to eruption, because we are on a line of different volcanoes. And but something that strikes me is that even though we have certain policies in place, especially the flooding in the rainy season, always caught us as a surprise. Every time we know that it's going to rain hard from May to October, especially harder in like I said, in September. But again, we encounter ourselves with exactly the same problems, and specifically in the same areas, flooding and everything. So when I say it will be one of the challenges, it will be for us to move further from what it is already established as written practices. We have written practices, we have manuals for teachers, But I don't think, I mean, the cluster and the Ministry of Education, we need to do a little bit more as to be aware that this is going to happen every year, and that we need to move forward and be aware of the different challenges that we will have every single year. Yeah, I'm gonna try to just to share my screen. To work a little bit faster on the things that I decided. I don't know if it is
Yep.
you can visualize it.
Yep, we can see it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the policy factor that I selected was bolstering monitoring systems, and I only selected parts of the policy issue, not all of it, especially related to 1.61 data management, the system, the collection, and the managing of the data.
Yes.
And the other one is the demographic data collected, especially for disadvantaged populations. As I said, we have in the preparedness area with this collecting system a medium emergency, because we have system put in place, databases and everything. And it's not in the case, and that's why I put it as very high, in the case of disadvantaged populations, especially students with needs. That is something that we haven't, you cannot see in the databases. And also important is in the response, again, and the recovery, the faces again the aspects get high in the data management, and very high with the demographic data. What records do we use? Well, the Ministry of Education records. We sometimes go and ask the projects that are in place in the areas that are presenting or are impacted by the crisis, in order to compare the information, and how reliable is the information. I mentioned that the data is very reliable for schools. I mean, to see how schools were impacted, but when the time comes to see the response and the recovery, it takes a lot of time to actually retrieve that information to see if students are coming back, if students are being, if the response to the emergency got to the students and the teachers, and if they return or they recover on time. And again, infrastructure is something that is important for the Ministry of Education. Sometimes the same schools are being used as shelters, so that is something that we are that is something that is important. But when we get to students, and especially the recovery phase, that is when it gets tougher. Or it's like if it's like if the emergency is gone, we responded to it better or for better or for worse, but the recovery is the part that I don't see we as paying attention. This is if we've forgotten about it, and once again we come with the problem the next year because we didn't learn the lesson of the year that we got. And that is what I would like to stress out.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important, because I think what you're touching on, I think, is education management information systems, and the degree to which these systems can bring together different types of data from different ministries and departments and units, to centralize this information so that it can actually be used efficiently. Is that correct? Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think look, the policy monitoring tool, we don't explicitly mention education management information systems, but certainly the characteristics of that criteria are there. And I'm wondering, before I throw it to the next person, whether a possible solution for Guatemala might be, to manage these information data requirements at the school level, because if it can't be centralized, then at least hopefully the schools have obtained enough data. And then as we prepare for recovery and preparation, we start to build capacity that approximates a more efficient education management information system at the system level. So we do what we can at the grassroots level, at the school level, but over time, we're buying time to prepare the EMIS for recovery and preparation. I mean, is that something that's being done in Guatemala?
I think it is being done, but not systematically. I mean, the school at the school level, they recover a lot of information. If you go to a school, they tell you how many teachers were sick, are sick, or how many students are still not coming from the emergency. But still the systematic part, it will be something that, like you say, Ian, thank you. It will be wonderful to actually teach how to make a systematic way of recovering that information in a simple way that could go up to, we have departments here at a departmental level and then move up to the central level. Yeah, thank you. I think it will be possible.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Patricia. That was very, very informative. Is Fiona in the audience?
I'm here. Hello.
Hi, Fiona. Hi. Is it Fiona or Patty? Oh, sorry. No, that's sorry. Patty is Patricia. I apologize. For that.
No, it's okay.
Hi.
It's Fiona.
Yeah.
Spelled
Hi, Fiona.
differently, but that's Fiona. Hi.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. Could you tell us a bit about yourself? Could you tell us about your organization, your engagement with education and emergencies, and then perhaps just talk through the two questions that we have here?
Okay. Just hello, everyone. It's afternoon here, so good afternoon. My name is Fiona Nakishero, and I'm a development economist. I'm also a communications and marketing professional, and I'm currently studying in South Africa. I'm originally from Uganda, and I worked there before the pandemic for 5 years with a local NGO that was doing education programs for children, countrywide programs like organizing the National Spelling Bee, doing community reading events, stocking libraries, training teachers and things like that. So when the pandemic struck, there were things that we couldn't do because of the pandemic, because we were social distancing and things like that. And so we turned to technology because we were working with the Ministry of Education in Uganda. And of course, because of the big number of children that do not have access to technology, especially in the rural areas, the model that we were using as an NGO was a cross-subsidy model where we were doing programs for the urban children who were paying for them so that we could provide free services for the local, the poorer communities upcountry. And so these communities couldn't have access to education, and that was sort of, it destabilized the way we were doing things, because the children who needed these services the most now couldn't have access to them. In South Africa, I'll give the context of South Africa as well, because I'm currently here. Schools were closed as well during the pandemic. And what was unique to South Africa was that during the pandemic, there were riots, there was political instability, and there were riots and looting, and the youth and students were involved in these activities. So it made it even more difficult to execute recovery programs or to respond to the pandemic or respond to education, providing education services to these youth, because there was all this other stuff going on. And a similarity between Uganda and South Africa is that the there are high refugee populations in Uganda and in South Africa, especially from DRC, with the war that's the instability that's happening there. So planning for these refugees during a pandemic is something that had to be looked at a policy level. Yep. So just to answer the questions that I want to, I hope I've introduced myself sufficiently.
No, it's great. Thank you.
Oh yeah. So just to answer the questions on the screen, in what ways might the PMT be used in your respective organization or government departments? So I'll look at how I think the governments in Uganda and South Africa can possibly use the PMT tool. I thought that it could help for governments to prioritize investments in technology for the greater populations in the countries, especially looking at people who are most vulnerable because they're poor or facing disabilities. I think that it was probably overlooked until a situation came where, you know, the only way that you could reach these children was through maybe television or radio, and a big population doesn't have access. So I think prioritizing advancements in technology in the education system at a policy level, making that investment at a high level is important going forward for preparation. And I think that using this PMT tool to sort of look at the risk and look at how it's maybe populations were affected in different categories as agents, as could help to prioritize technology at a government policy level.
Yeah. I do have a question.
Yes.
If I could just quickly interrupt. You know, the implementation of technology, I don't think anyone would disagree with that, but the capacity building required to use that technology may not be uniformly, you know, experienced, available to all people. And yes. I'm just wondering, are there particular agents, are there particular stakeholders or community members in this situation that were very important to engage with? You know, one of the factors that we have are agent factors, right?
Yes.
So were there particular groups that could help perhaps with capacity building for information technology?
I think it comes back to school level, the teachers and the schools basically, because this is where children, if they don't have a television at home, if there's access to such kind of radio or whatever at the community center, maybe at a local government center or at the school, then these children can still have access, maybe gather together, find a way to so I think still teachers through training is an important avenue, and then also the local government or local chiefs or those agents, yeah. And then also not forgetting the NGOs that are operating locally to be able to work with, because we found that in Uganda, for example, there were people that were doing book giving drives, local communities that were giving books, storybooks and learning material to students in the communities. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry for interrupting.
No, it's okay. I hope I've answered the question sufficiently.
Yes, yes.
So just maybe to go to the next question, could you tell us a little about the challenges faced when developing policies for education in emergencies? I think I mentioned the complexity of if there's political instability within the situation where you're trying to provide education services within an emergency. So then it destabilizes maybe the government at that level, but also if the students are involved in violence, and then it becomes a health issue, it becomes I just found that it was complex in that level, in that way. And then also dealing with immigrants, like here in South Africa, there's a high community of both legal and illegal immigrants from Zimbabwe, from DRC. So it becomes more difficult to plan for a population that is not clearly registered.
Yeah. With those populations that are not clearly adjusted, and this is my last question before I throw to the next individual. I mean, is there a way that we can, and I know integrate is the wrong word, because I don't think we want to integrate people. We want to accept them, we want to welcome them, we want to be inclusive. Have you found that in your experience, there are particular approaches that enable this inclusivity, this approach to target vulnerable populations in this case?
Sorry, say that, repeat the question.
Yeah. So have you found that in your experience, are there any
Yes.
particular strategies that have proven to be efficient or successful with meeting the needs of these marginalized communities?
Yeah, I think the best way, I think, to integrate them into the community is to empower them, because there's a sense of there's stigma if they're dependent. That's right. Or if they seem like they're a burden. But if they're empowered through maybe education and sort of given an opportunity to make a living for themselves, maybe integrated economically into the communities, and then they're more accepted than if they're either put separately or segregated into camps or whatever. But also if they're dependent on aid only, then it becomes harder to integrate them. I don't know if I'm making much sense. But yeah, finding ways to integrate them into the education system, but also providing ways for them to earn a living is a way that makes them more acceptable into the community. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would add as well that schools probably have a key role to play in that regard, insofar as enabling the teachers to support the integration of these students into the community so that they do not feel ostracized and that they do feel a sense of belonging in the place that they're at. Yes.
I don't know if I'm supposed to show the presentation. I was told that I would, someone would share it for me. Do I need to share my screen?
I think we might be running out of time at this point.
Okay, no problem.
But you've been very, very informative. So thank you so much.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Fiona. Yeah. Is Sander in the audience? Sander. Okay. I think Sander is in the audience, but may not be able to access the conversation. Okay, so look, if we are running a little bit short on time, so I might move on to the next slide. And the next slide welcomes back the three speakers that we had previously. So Fiona, Patricia, and who have I missed out? I've missed out on someone. I apologize. Just trying to find my notes. So we've got Allah. That's right. So we've got Allah, Patricia, and Fiona. If able to, could you please turn on your camera, or at least unmute yourself? What we'd like to do is just talk really quickly in the next 5 or 10 minutes or so about the following discussion questions. The purpose of these questions is really to try to identify what types of data you used to inform your policy mapping. One of the key things that I talked about in workshop number 1 was that we want to be reliant on reliable and valid data. And I'm wondering if we could have just a quick conversation about how you were able to identify this data, why you identified this data, and very importantly, how this data might be systematized for use across preparedness, response, and recovery phases, and inform short, medium, and long-term strategies for change. So perhaps we could start with Allah. Allah, are you still there with us?
Hello, yes, but sorry, I have like some internet connections issues, but it's fine for now.
No
All right.
worries.
All right.
No worries.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Would you be able to perhaps walk us through your thoughts about data with respect to the following questions? So why were your sources of data selected? How were you able to determine that they were reliable and valid? How might you use this data to systematize information, data usage across preparedness, response, and recovery phases? And is it possible to perhaps create strategies from this data to develop short, medium, and long-term approaches to addressing education and emergencies? I realize that there are a lot of questions there. So perhaps maybe pick one, and then we could see how we go from there.
Okay. All right. I hope I got like the questions, meaning and everything. So in regards to the source of evidence and data, let's say from my experience working in education and these kind of projects, I think the main source of data was the UN.
The UN.
And agencies and other NGOs, UN and other NGOs, because for some ministries or maybe many, there were like no up-to-date data, and similar to the issue that mentioned by my colleague, Particia, I think, similar but like not exactly the same. Because in some cases it's really advanced, but in other cases it's really need to be updated. So from the ministry, there were like lack of up-to-date data, but yeah, for the secondary data, the UN agencies and other NGOs, actually because it's built on a significant a scientific ways of collecting the data, like research, study, and sometimes for the NGOs I worked with, not even sometimes, but most of the time they were like to do our own study and primary data, and based on data driven, based on evidence by primary sources and primary data collection. So yes, how might policy evidence collected inform a range of policy and policy levels across preparedness and response, and recovery phases? First of all, I think it's maybe it's a complex or a long process, but I think it should be applied in a best way to get the best result. There should be a cluster and collaboration between government and NGOs, and government should enhance their systems and their education policies and everything, and then keep monitoring and keep the learning across the years, across everything, different factors like social media affect everything now. It really has a role, as well as media, as well as like everything is changed rapidly, and they should be up to date and consider all the factors, especially from year to another. Everything like changed rapidly. So there should be high collaboration with the NGOs and the UN agencies who work specifically in education, and more collaboration and more up-to-date information and sources to enhance all these policies and take it into account. And for example, one of the things, there's of course there's good action being taken, such as like all child should go to schools regardless if they are Jordanians, let's say in Jordan context, or not Jordanian or not registered, as comparing to what mentioned before. But there should be like how they implement these policies and how they policies should be monitored. I think there is gaps in this system and how these policies are if it changed, how we monitor this change and how this change should be reflected on all stakeholders and how they accept it and how it affects them, and they should be a part of this change, because I think we don't take into account the community consideration or the ones who already involved in this education or in this situation. We should consider their opinions, their feedback. We also better to have community work with more, like have more involved in education. I think at least in my case in here. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that. Okay, well, thank you for your response. Alaa, I note that there is a question for you specifically in the chat. So perhaps I think it's Ivan. You could respond to him while I throw to the
Yeah.
next person.
Okay.
So thank you very much for your response, and thank you for participating in this discussion, this dialogue. Patricia, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Hi, Patricia. I'll leave it up to you. You can pick either question 2 or question 3 or question 1, because unfortunately we are running short of time, and we would love to hear, I guess, a response that you would like to provide for one of these 3 questions over here. Which one would you like to focus on?
Okay, I'm going to try to answer number 3. How my policy evidence collected inform a range of policies. I'm reading for my benefit too. I think the fact that the information is collected from the bottom up, it is something that it is done in Guatemala, but again, there are certain things. For example, when I was reading question 2 and we were saying to inform a heat map, again, we don't pay attention to that particular part in terms of policy. We are very focused into the preparedness part of the emergency, but the recovery usually gets us into an activism that puts in place processes, but the policies related to I mean, returning students or actually giving students a sense of let's say stability and preparedness for the recovery phases. So yes. Another thing that it is important to consider is that at the short range of these policies, they usually encounter themselves with politics, and sometimes the policies in place that could be piloted, or they could be already being worked by some institutions, they are usually halted because they are going to provide information from an administration that doesn't want people to, the citizens to know that actually they were not that prepared for an emergency. Like I said, and I repeat, it happens every year. So that evidence should be more regularly collected, should be something that the organizations require as a report for those institutions member of a cluster, and from there inform, analyze and inform their policies in place, so they could actually create a plan of what is going to happen at the short time, let's say in the next year, and at least prepare for 4 years and in the 3 phases. I don't know if I'm answering the question correctly, and over.
I think you are. I think you are, and I think you're emphasizing the importance of collaboration and communication and working across departments within the ministry and ministries within government. because it sounds like the need for collaboration and engagement and partnership especially is very important. I suspect that you might be informed also by the clusters that are working across South American or Latin American countries. Would that be correct?
Yes. Our cluster collaborates for clusters from other countries from Latin America, but
Yes.
again, we need to do it in a more systematic way to learn lessons of.
Yes. Thank you so much, Patricia. Okay, I might throw to Fiona, and then I think we have a new person coming into the conversation. I think it's LL. Fiona, after you address either 1, 2, or 3, I'll throw to L and see what he or she would like to talk about. Okay. So Fiona, you have the floor.
Yes, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, good. So I think I'll touch on 1. I'll do question 1, but might integrate a little bit of question 2. So the sources that were selected were mostly from secondary, there were secondary sources, there were secondary data from reports from the Ministry of Education, which are great, but I think we could include some primary data, do some research to be able to inform the heat map, because while you're looking at secondary data or secondary reports and things like that, they might not be specific to the policy issues that you're trying to tackle, even though they might have some information. So to be able to get specific data for a specific maybe policy issue and to go into that detail to be able to get the most reliable and valid information to inform the heat map, we may have to use a combination of the secondary data, but also to use some primary data. So that's the short short answer.
Sure.
Yeah.
I just have a, sorry, were you finished or?
Yes.
Okay. I think look, one of the questions that perhaps we as researchers or we as policymakers sometimes do not ask enough of is a question relating to the methodology underlying the validity and reliability of the data. I know for myself, for example, I sometimes go to UIS or I go to the OECD and I take the data, but I don't really inspect the methodology behind how that data was gathered together, or at least I don't do it as often as I probably should, because it's almost a given that if it's from a multinational like the OECD, well, that's very, very important. So I'm wondering whether in your line of work, yourself or others inspect the nature of the data and the methodology behind that data and how it was gathered together, whether that's a consideration in your experience.
With data from international organizations, no, probably not. But when you're looking at academic papers and things like that, then you go and look at the methodology. But same situation. Once it's from UNICEF, you assume that it's done. It's done the right way. So that maybe is something that also could be looked into. That in spite of where you're getting the data from, you just need to validate and make sure that it is in fact reliable.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much. Okay, so thank you to our speakers. We have one final person who would like to, I think, pose a comment or pose a question. I think it's LL. So LL, are you there? LL, are you there? Would you like to pose your question or would you like to make a comment? Okay, perhaps L's having a bit of connectivity issues. Okay. Well, thank you once again to all the participants for this section. Look, I would just like to reiterate a couple of things. The first is that the purpose of the policy monitoring tool at its heart is really to gather data and really to gather evidence of what's occurring within the policy space so that this information can subsequently be used to inform policymaking and strategies and ways forward during times of emergency, whether it's preparation, response, or recovery. So I think the three questions that we have here are particularly important. So if you could consider that, I think, that would probably be one way forward to improving practice. Before I close this section, are there any comments or any questions at all from the greater audience that you'd like to throw?
I have a question, actually. Can I ask it?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. Because this tool and covering all these stages, are we implementing any of these on current situation in any country or in any situation, such as maybe Ukraine or Yemen or?
Yeah, the simple answer is no. But what we did do was that we actually applied this for a UNESCO paper where we provided a response for the Asia Pacific Ministers of Education. So we use this framework to inform, policies for recovery, for preparation. And so to that extent, it's been applied within that context. I think that was 2022 when we published that paper. So I believe it's in the references that we've provided you last week, but we're happy to provide you that reference again if you would like. So, this is really an opportunity for us to also engage with practitioners like yourself and others to know whether this framework actually works at a practitioner level, not just at a very high policy level.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, my question is, I have been wondering how this policy monitoring tool and complemented to the minimum standards and of interagency network education emergency in terms of education emergency. I will ask how those tools are complementing each other.
Yeah. Are you referring to the INEE minimum standards specifically?
Yeah, the minimum
Yes.
standards
Yep.
of education. Yeah.
Yes. No, it's a great question. I think our particular framework is actually targeting policymakers specifically. Okay. Whereas when we look at the INEE's minimum standards, they're actually engaging a very wide stakeholder group. And I think, they've been around for much, much longer. So they've been able to develop multiple contingencies and plannings for different stakeholder groups. But our focus were primarily targeting policymakers. What do they need? How do we ensure that policymakers are appropriately informed of grassroots level considerations and problems, but also those at a very, very high level and everything in between? When we developed this framework, a key consideration was the INEE's framework and how does it align? And I think what we can confidently say, at least with our framework, is that it actually does map to their particular considerations and policies and challenges outlined by the minimum standards in the INEE framework. So we're confident that there is overlap. It is not inconsistent, but the difference is that we target specifically policymakers. I hope that answers your question. Okay. Are there any other questions, perhaps?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Okay. So I think we might have a break at this point. Thank you very much for your time and the opportunity to engage in this dialogue with you. We'll now take a 5-minute break. And when we return, Cameron will lead a discussion applying the tool to teaching and learning, specifically the teaching and learning factors. Okay, factor. Thank you very much. See you soon. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a chance to get a drink of water or perhaps stretch your legs a little bit. We unfortunately were not able to get through to all the speakers that we had invited to discuss their thoughts previously. So I'm wondering if we could perhaps try that again. We have Abdi Kadir and we have Sandar, who were previously invited to talk about some of their impressions regarding the policy monitoring tool. So perhaps we could start with Abdi Kadir, and then after that, Sandar, just in alphabetical order. Abdi Kadir, are you still there at all? Abdi Kadir? Or perhaps Issa Farah? Abdi Kadir Issa Farah? Are you there at all? We'll just give Abdi Kadir maybe a few more seconds to try to respond. We know that we were able to engage him previously. Hopefully he's able to connect with us again. Abdi Kadir, are you there? Okay, all right. Let's throw it to Sandar and see if Sandar is there at all. Sandar, are you there? Sandar, are you there? No, I think Sandar is not in the participant list. Okay, that's all right. So I'm going to take this time to throw to my colleague Cameron, who's going to take us through the application of the PMT to the teaching and learning factor. Cameron, all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. And thank you all for sharing your feedback and engagement with the policy monitoring tool and with its application to your circumstances. And one of the things we found about when we reviewed your input into that one-page activity we asked you to do was there was a strong emphasis on the relevance of the teaching and learning factor, that many of you thought that those considerations and issues were highly pertinent to some of the contexts and factors that you are considering in your circumstances. So we thought it would be a great opportunity to spend a little bit of time in this session to together go through and see if we can apply the tool collectively. And I'll ask each of you to consider how specific issues relate to your circumstances or circumstances that you're familiar with, and then volunteer to give a risk rating for each, for a phase, and then talk a little bit about why you gave that risk rating. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen so you can see the tool. So if you just give me one moment. Okay, here we go.
Sorry, late. I'm ready. How are you? Yeah. Sorry for late. I'm ready. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, who is that? I missed your name. Who's that speaking?
Okay. No?
I think it's Abdi Kadir, Cameron.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think at this stage we should probably push on, and maybe if we have a bit of time, maybe we can, in the chat, Ian, you might be able to just communicate and confirm with Abdi what his intentions are and the strength of his connectivity, and maybe a bit later in the session we might be able to engage him in his feedback. But we'll just push on with this section for now.
Thanks.
So you can all see the at least a segment of a live version of the policy monitoring tool. And yeah, as you can see, currently what we are doing is looking at the So you can see the systems factor and the risk rating up there. And I'll scroll down now to the teaching and learning factor. So this is a broad type of factor, and under it, there are a number of policy considerations. And then under each one of these considerations, so these are a group of activities that policymakers need to consider, there are specific issues. And then for each one of these issues, policymakers need to consider how they would rate the risk for each phase of emergency management. So I thought we could go through a couple of these pertinent issues that we thought were relevant to the input that you provided us in your one-page activity. So you can see the first consideration for teaching and learning that we'll look at is embedding assessment into emergency contexts. And a specific sub-issue within that consideration, you can see highlighted here in blue, is assessments that were used prior to emergency are adjusted for the recovery phase of an emergency. So what this issue is getting at is that before an emergency, there may be an existing cycle of assessments. But when an emergency strikes, policymakers may need to find that they need to adjust assessments. For example, they might need to do a rapid assessment right after an emergency to identify the effects of the emergency on learning. They might want to monitor the impact of emergency measures. So to what extent are replacement measures taking an impact on having an effect on learning? Or policymakers may also want to only assess certain domains and maybe narrow assessments. So I'll just make this a little bigger for
Cameron, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And now, so I'm going to ask you, can anyone please volunteer? If we look at the recovery phase, we'll focus on the recovery phase for this one, as well as response actually. Could you please volunteer how you would rate the risk in the circumstances you're familiar with for this particular issue? So, for example, if you feel that the circumstances you're familiar with, that policymakers are not very prepared at adjusting assessments, making adjustment to assessments, you would say that is high risk or very high risk that this issue is not being addressed. However, if you think the circumstances you're familiar with, policymakers are ready and prepared to make adjustments to assessments and change the assessments necessary in terms of an emergency context, you might say it's low risk or medium risk. So can anyone please volunteer in your circumstances or the ones you're familiar with? How would you rate this in the response phase, for example? And you can turn your camera on or speak, or you can even just put it in the chat as well.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me? Yes.
I can.
Yes, may I share some example from our please? Yeah, for that line, especially 2.1.2, there are two parts in my country. I'm from Myanmar. Now in our country, there happening emergency situation a lot. After COVID, there are also military coup that happen also as well. So at that situation, in terms of assessment, prior assessment, with the government part, especially to the military coup, military government, state authority council, some of the NGO sector, they didn't, collaborate much to this body, authority body. However, in our country, there are upper part of Myanmar and lower part of Myanmar. There is a emergency working group. They are usually do such kind of update information, and those information are very, linked to the previous slide, very valid, reliable. However, the information that the government also, that working group also have to report to the government at the time, such information is make-up information, because depend on that data, the government they can guess the household or population of such kind of situation, contextual. I mean, the at that local, it means that some of the area that is in non-government control, that were controlled by especially from armed group, ethnic and has to reach area. So for back to the question, we have a proper assessment, especially that was sponsored by NGO and INGO. That is very valid and proper, progress. However, in the collaboration with government, that is really high risk, because they didn't have nationwide support to such kind of situation, because there are so many attack happen here, especially aircraft or something like that. So for that situation, the information that we share to the government is not a pure data to that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. There was a lot there that you shared with us, and I really appreciate that. So I can see that assessment is relevant and also problematic for your situation. Do you think that you could have a go of maybe providing a bit of a risk to try and distill some of the information you provided there? Do you think either in terms of preparing for emergencies or the response or the recovery from them, what risk would you allocate for this particular issue around adjusting assessments for emergencies?
Yes, for that matter, the challenge is data security, because most of the non-government control area, they don't want to share a data. At that time, we have we have to promise them that is very confidential. Because without that information, we couldn't support them well. So we need the information time to time. Because especially in emergency situation, the challenge is data. Data. How can not data handy, because to be honest, why we are saying about the digitalization, that is really, a very big issue what happened in here in my country. Because if you carry on a data pack or data set, that is, it's like a crime. It's mean that you are a person who reveal to the government. That's why data collection is very sensitive, even online, because in an online data system that was controlled by SEC, State Authority Council, that's why we have a very sensitive situation for that case. So how do we solve that problem? We have a risk mitigation plan, but at the same time, most of the data and most of the organization, they are not based in country, but based in Thai Myanmar border area. And also some of the data are in a Thai side, registered in a Thai government, registered in country government. That is some of the solution that we are doing.
Thank you.
Here.
I might.
Another one is.
Thank you so much for all that engagement. And we'd really love to touch base with you after. Maybe we could work more closely with you in applying the tool and addressing some of those problems. But I think it's a little bit beyond the scope of this activity to get into to help to get into too much detail there. But thanks very much. And as I said, we're definitely happy to work with you afterwards. But I can tell actually it's clearly very high risk for you in that situation, that having access to even the data that comes from assessments, it seems like assessment is not a high priority in that context, let alone adjusting them for emergency situation. So I'll move on to the next issue now. Firstly, the next consideration. So this is still within the teaching and learning. And you can see, and I think you mentioned it there to yourself, relating to digital. So implementing digital teaching and learning is the consideration. So we found in our all the review of responses to education in emergency that this came up over and over, the importance of digital teaching and learning. But there are a number of issues that need to be considered when thinking about implementing digital teaching and learning. So we'll just go into a little bit more focus onto one specific issue, and you'll be able to see up there on the screen. The one we'll focus on is mobile learning is utilized to reach greater numbers of students, adapting curriculum and pedagogy as needed. And by mobile learning, we mean mostly the use of mobile phones or cell phones to reach students. So we found that in a number of contexts, obviously there are, in lower income countries, not all students have access to desktop computers. They don't all have, for example, high-speed fiber optic connections. We found mobile phones and cell phones were really an essential part of delivering education. However, it's important that what is done through the use of phones is adapted. So the curriculum and pedagogy is adapted. Obviously, we can't pretend that it's a typical school environment. So these things have to be adapted. So when it comes to preparing for emergencies, policymakers need to think, well, are we ready to make use of mobile phones? They know that often for a lot of students in countries, mobile phones will be the only way they can access students. So are they ready to be able to continue education with the utilization of mobile phones? So does anyone else want to volunteer a risk rating in terms of, let's talk about preparedness, focus on the preparedness phase for now. Does anyone want to volunteer a risk rating of, so it'd obviously be, if policymakers and the circumstances you're familiar with, if there isn't much consideration about how we can make use of mobile phones and adapt the pedagogy and the curriculum, that would obviously be high risk or very high risk. But if policymakers have really considered how we can use mobile phones in emergency education situations, and they have given some thought about how they would adapt the pedagogy and curriculum, then that would be a lower or medium risk. So does anyone want to turn their camera on and their microphone on and provide a risk rating? Or you could just drop something in the chat too. Either you could just write, the risk rating, low risk, medium risk, high risk, for example.
I can say something. I think mobile learning might be high risk because of maybe internet penetration in the different contexts. In my context, it's not much. It's less than 50% people have access to internet. So mobile learning then becomes a challenge. And so that would make it high risk, yeah.
Okay, great. So that's it. So clearly they're not prepared for it. And incidentally, we did find that mobile phones were the most widely available form of digital technology. So it's not necessarily the most preferred form, but we found that it had the highest level of penetration and ubiquity within population. So they were seen as a kind of a fallback way to reach students if they couldn't be reached by any other means in regards to digital technology. But it sounds like even in your circumstances, mobiles doesn't have that reliability. So clearly, if they're not prepared in terms of using mobiles because of the lack of access, then clearly we can also say it's we'd probably even say it's very high risk, and in terms of response and recovery as well. We've got time to do a couple more issues before we move on to the final section, which involves a bit more broader reflection.
We've got a question from Patricia. We've got a question from Patricia Cameron.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Do you want to?
no, sorry, Kenra. It's not a question, more like a comment from the past one. I think something that, again, we have missed the opportunity is the fact that adapting the pedagogy and the curriculum during COVID-19, we did a lot of effort, and those efforts were again missed once we returned to in-person modalities, and there is the online opportunities, the mobile opportunities are great opportunities, especially in emergency context. But again, I think it is important to do this revision of the material, this revision of the approaches and the curriculum in order to see what is worked. As it is right now in my country, the only level of education that has kept working with the online modality is the higher education sector. So I think it's something that is important to continue. And you mentioned something important, and with that I will finish, is the fact that it is important to convince the whole community that when you are using an online approach, doesn't mean that 4 hours of in-person necessarily mean 4 hours of in screen or in contact with any mobile, being low tech or being a screen. So I think it's important that convincing part, and the other part is to guarantee a certain level of quality in the teaching that you are delivering when you are teaching online. Over.
Great. Thank you very much, Patricia. And I think that really highlights the importance of adapting the curriculum and pedagogy for when different modalities are applied during emergency situations. So, for example, when mobile phones are used, we can't pretend that the same kinds of things or learning activities are occurring outside of those classroom activities. We really do need to adapt the pedagogy and curriculum. So I'll move on to the next policy issue, and this relates to applying multiple teaching modalities. So it really segues well with what you were saying, Patricia. So I can see a comment too there in the chat that Chris made about that they weren't able to use mobiles, that they used radio in the situations that he was familiar with. So this particular issue recognizes that when the COVID lockdowns happened, there was a lot of just assumptions that, oh, we'll just switch to digital. I mean, I think what we found in our review was that a lot of the lower tech solutions were far better at accessing a broader population. So this issue really is looking at how low cost and low technology approaches, so including, for example, mail, printing out materials and delivering them by hand, in some instances using TV and radio. So when is it appropriate to use these? Have policymakers considered when it's appropriate to use these technologies as opposed to relying on digital solutions, or as opposed to trying to maintain usual classroom teaching? So does anyone want to provide a volunteer in the circumstances they're familiar with? To what extent are they aware that policymakers have given much consideration to the use of these lower tech solutions? So in the preparedness, for example. You can just write a risk rating in the chat if you like, or you can turn your camera on and start speaking.
Hi, maybe I can participate in this point. This is Ala. Hello.
Please.
Yeah. So I think I think in this point, policymakers will think about different stuff together. They have have different consideration for different things, because media and education and there are different policies and law that mix together. So I think it's a high risk in many of countries and regions, to use maybe TV and radio to influence or to use it for education. But I think it's really a good thing to think about, especially in countries like, I was surprised about the percentage provided by my colleague, less than 15. It's really, I really shocked, because for example, here in Jordan, like all people use, even vulnerable people, they have like smartphones and everyone has internet connection. But when the COVID happened, yeah, of course, like not everyone have laptops. Like sometimes the internet connection was like couldn't be affordable, so they have to buy like more and more. So yeah, but like everyone here, even in the camps, even in the like rural areas, everyone has like their smartphones. So yeah, it differs from country to another, from region to another, from context to another. I think technology, it's really important to be addressed, or to be integrated in all kind of crises, I think, or in all countries. Maybe this should be like a pre-stage by the policymakers, even if there is no crisis happen, because future is technology, future is metaverse, future everything. So they already should think about technology to be integrated for many reasons. However, yes, using TVs, radio. I don't know about
Thank you
maybe
very
printed
much
material. It depends on the crisis itself. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And I can see how it's really interesting how within this group here, we have quite different actual circumstances and different experiences of the situations that you're in. So we had a participant just earlier saying mobile phones were not adequate. They couldn't reach a broad section of the population. And then you just shared with us that actually they were actually quite effective at reaching a broad section of the population. And I think that's why this tool can be so helpful, because it actually recognizes that there are different circumstances, and policymakers need to give the risk rating for each issue for their own circumstances. So for some circumstances, there'll be very low risk because policymakers will be able to see, well, everyone's got access to mobile phones, and they will have considered how they will be used. In other circumstances, it'll be quite high risk. So thank you for that. It really highlights there are different circumstances. And I think there is no foreseeable future where the earth will be flat, where everyone will be in the same situation, that actually there will continue to be diversity on these different circumstances. So there is a need for the tool to be applied so that different risk ratings are used. So I think, unfortunately, I would love to go through this whole tool and give every issue a risk rating with you, and maybe at a future time, if you're interested, we can work with you in applying the tool. However, for now, and now that I've given you a bit of a taste in how it could be applied, I will have to go on to the next section. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and I will pass you over to Pina, who will facilitate a broader discussion about the tool.
Thank you everyone for your participation. It's been so interesting to hear the details about the particular areas of education emergencies that you've been considering and focusing on when you've been working through the worksheet and considering the issues in the policy monitoring tool. We've very much appreciated all the feedback as well. So what we'd like to do now is we don't have a great deal of time left in the workshop. And what we'd like to ask you to do is to join the Slido, and please, if you could, answer the question, what are your key takeaways from workshop 2? So we've got one participant typing already. So we're looking forward to receiving your comments about some of the key things that you've gained from participating in the workshops, in particular workshop 2, and including the use of the use of the policy monitoring tool as well. So we've got a question from Chris where he says, I'm having a hard time understanding how the tool could work in settings like Eastern DRC that have been in conflict and crisis for nearly 30 years. Do you have any thoughts on that? Well, as we've always said, the tool doesn't necessarily cover every single aspect of all education emergencies, and particularly these protracted conflicts and crisis situations. So it could be that the tool can be adapted and enhanced to try and address some of these more broader ongoing conflicts and crisis. So that's something that that you could consider. If you have any comments about that, would be interested to hear from you as well. So Chris, if you've got any further comments about that too, in terms of how you've used the tool so far. So some of the feedback, how to use the tool and the framework, not only at the central level, but using at the school level. Yes, that's great. How the PMF might be helpful to give a snapshot of different types of crisis happening simultaneously and help cross-agency conversation. Using radio and TV is low risk, to use them as tools for education and emergency. Yes, that's correct. Depending on if everyone has access to TV and radio as well. And yes, and also considering how this could be implemented in my context. And the diversity of experiences across different regions has been really great to hear as well. And Cameron's just responded to Chris's comment as well and said some of the issues could be marked as NA, whereas other issues will be relevant and given a risk rating. So someone else has said the importance of context in using the PMT tool. That's a very important point, because the way that when we developed the tool and drawing from all of the literature, we also took into consideration that there would be various contexts. So we wanted the tool to be context neutral, so that it could be adapted if needed to different contexts. So it should be flexible enough to be adapted to different contexts. So there's another comment. I think there should be apply one standardized law or policy to be implemented as agreement by high levels of policymakers across countries. I guess that this is where the issue that we just mentioned just now about context. Context does have an impact. And so it may not be possible to just have one policy across many countries. However, the tool is used to support policymakers and not to replace policies. It's there to be used to help the development of policies and review of policies. So technology demand after COVID and the EIE setting, not really sure exactly what that means. It could be based on some of the discussion we've had already about considering the use of technology after COVID in particular. So I've got one more participant typing something. Okay, we've got a few more participants. So I know we had quite a number of comments in workshop 1 about the PMF as well. Yes, correct. So lessons learned and best practices by other countries can help. Exactly. And so that's when we developed the policy monitoring tool and the framework. That's why we looked across countries and across emergency situations. So reliable data will help make using the tool and the risk ratings more accurate. Yes, we totally agree with that. So we'd like to thank everyone for participating in the 2 workshops. It's been really great to have you involved and to have your expertise and your feedback on the use of the tool. And the there was a question earlier that Ian answered about whether the tool had been used by in an actual education emergency situation, and no, it hasn't. So if the tool is something that you would like to use to help it inform your work, you're very welcome to utilize the tool. You have a copy of it. I also shared in the chat the link to the full rapid review of education emergencies, where we have the full tool in the appendix at the end of that document as well. So we believe that the use of the tool will help to refine it, and it will make it a much stronger tool that can be used, as someone mentioned earlier, across multiple contexts and also across multiple education emergency situations as well. So we very much welcome any further feedback that you would like to provide to us. You can use the QR codes on the screen. You can also join the ECCN network and other learning networks or regional hubs. Forward the link to your colleagues and share the information resources through the LinkedIn channels. And thank you so much for engaging with the workshops and sharing so much of your information, and spending your time, your own time, completing the workshop, the worksheet activity as well for workshop 2. And thank you so much again.